Hi everyone, welcome back to the second lesson on the endocrine system. Hopefully by looking at this cover slide you feel confident that you can label all of these without looking at the key at the top. Just a little reminder there for you. This lesson we are going to be moving on to look at the endocrine system in more detail, how it functions, and at the end of the lesson we're going to be looking at one specific hormone and how it works in relation to something called homeostasis. This topic has quite a lot of key words, so some of these are being repeated just to try and get you used to them. Some of them you may have seen before in different topics, but please take the time to look at these keywords, make sure you're comfortable with them, and be confident that you can identify them and even explain what they mean. So to start off with, in this lesson, we are going to be looking at the differences between the endocrine and the nervous system. Previously, we studied the nervous system and we understand that nerve impulses are fast acting. We have the central nervous system, which encompasses the brain and the spinal cord, and that's down the central axis of the body. And we also have the peripheral nervous system, which encompasses everything else. The endocrine system, on the other hand, is a series of specific organs located at points around the body, and they release chemical substances called hormones. So physically, they look very, very different. Now, we are going to be exploring how they are different. If we look at this Venn diagram here, we can see that what they have in common in the overlapping region between the two circles here are that they are both communication systems. That means that they send messages around the body and they carry out effects. But what you can see is that the way that they carry out these effects are very different. We know that the nervous system is very fast acting, whereas the endocrine system acts very slowly. The nervous system has almost immediate yet short-term effects, and these impulses travel by electrical communication carried by nerve impulses. So that fast-acting effect is directly related to the fact that it uses electrical communication. If we contrast that with the endocrine system, we can see that the effects of hormones are much longer lasting, they go on for a longer period of time, and they take longer to initiate an effect. That's because we don't use electrical communication. Instead, we're using chemicals, and these hormones travel through our bloodstream, not down these nerve wire-like structures. What I'd like you to do just now is to pause the video and complete the table on page 4 of your booklet using this Venn diagram to help you. Once you've done that, press play and we'll move on to the next section. Alright, so also on the same page, I think, or the page before or after in your booklet, we're asked to look at the difference between an endocrine and an exocrine gland. So if we look at this diagram on the right-hand side, it's fairly obvious that they are structurally different. Exocrine glands, these are glands that secrete or give out secretions of some description. So you have got a duct or a tube-like structure where the contents are delivered, or they're produced in cells and they then enter these ducts, and then what actually happens is those secretions are moved out onto the surface, for example. Good examples of that would be your salivary glands, those are exocrine glands, and also your sweat glands. So you have ducts in the skin that produce secretions and they move that out. If it's the skin, it'll be sweat to the skin surface. If it's the salivary glands, then it would be salivary liquid that's secreted into your mouth. What we are focusing on is this structure here, which is an endocrine gland. So endo means inside. So what we have here, these groups of cells, these are endocrine glands, and what they do is they secrete hormones which travel in the bloodstream, and they travel using that network, that blood vessel network, to go to a different place. So you need to be able to know the difference and explain the difference between an endocrine and an exocrine gland. I've given you some examples here. Please make sure that you note that down in your booklet before moving on. All right, so now we're going to be looking at this word homeostasis and understanding how that relates to the endocrine or the hormone system. Homeostasis is the way that living organisms such as humans maintain a constant internal environment. Now, what that means is if something in your body gets too high, homeostasis will bring down that level to get down to a set point where it's lower. Similarly, if something's too low, it will bring that back up to a set point where it should be higher. The endocrine system manages this seesaw actioning of homeostasis through hormones, which are chemical messengers. We know that we have lots of different endocrine glands, and these glands secrete hormones which then travel into the bloodstream. Now, this cartoon here just demonstrates how that works. So this is fundamental to understanding hormone action. Even though this seems like a basic diagram, there's a lot going on here. First of all, we have our endocrine gland, or one cell from an endocrine gland. These green dots represent the hormones. So they are secreted from the endocrine tissue and they transport themselves in the bloodstream. So when they enter the bloodstream and they transport their way along, they don't just go to any cell. They will only move out of the blood and move towards a cell that has a receptor on it. So you can see that the shape of this receptor on the surface of the cell is complementary to the shape of the hormone. So because these fit in like what we would say a lock and key mechanism, we know that the hormone has reached the right cell and it's going to action whatever it needs to action. So that's an important point about hormones. They only bind with receptor cells that have receptors of the same shape. Okay, just to recap, endocrine glands secrete hormones. Hormones are chemical messengers, and these hormones are transported in the blood. All our body cells will come into contact with hormones, however, only target cells are affected. And we know that only target cells are affected because only target cells have receptors on them where the hormone can bind to. All right, so how does that affect homeostasis? Well, if we look at this diagram here, what we can see is, I mentioned before, the seesaw effect. In a perfect world, we would like to remain perfectly level at this exact point here on that beam. But that's not life. That's not how things happen inside your body, because if you eat something, for example, your blood glucose level rises and you have now gone beyond that set point. If you go for maybe 4 or 5 hours without eating anything, your blood glucose level dips and you go below that set point. Your body is always trying to get you to maintain this perfect balance. So it's always adjusting itself to do that. If you look at this diagram here, we can see that what activates our homeostatic mechanism is the stimulus. The stimulus in the example I just talked about would be that you ate something, therefore your blood sugar level increases. There are receptor cells in your body that detect that change in blood glucose level. That stimulus is detected by receptors, which will send information to the modulator, which is known as the control center. The control center decides what to do, and that sends information to an effector, which carries out a response, and that response will be, in this example, to lower blood glucose levels, and they go back down to normal. So just to recap, homeostasis is the tendency to resist change in order to maintain a relatively stable internal environment. And homeostasis normally involves something called negative feedback. And what negative feedback is a response that is the exact opposite to the stimulus. So in this example, we had an increase in blood glucose levels, therefore the response was to decrease it. Once we decrease it and we get to this level balance again, that is known as a set point. So following on, negative feedback control is how the human body maintains homeostasis. So this is a term that you should get comfortable with. Negative feedback control helps us to control that internal environment using these key words here. So we have an initial stimulus, which is picked up by a receptor. That is passed on to a modulator or the control center. We have effectors that make adjustments, which then leads to a response. Now you'll notice in this diagram, there's no beginning and end. It's a constant loop. So we don't ever say that there's a start and an end in a negative feedback system. It's a continual process. All right, so at this point, it'll be a good opportunity for you to stop and reflect on what we've learned so far. So please can you pause the video and read pages 9 and 10 of your class booklet. Once you've done that and you are comfortable with the language and the terminology, I'd like you to watch this short video explaining what homeostasis is. Bearing in mind, once you've read pages 9 and 10 in your booklet, I would like you to make sure that you are comfortable with and understand the definitions of the terms highlighted in red. Hi, welcome back, guys. So now that you have a good understanding of homeostasis and negative feedback, we are going to apply that mechanism to hormones and hormone actions within the body. This diagram here shows part of the central nervous system, and there's two areas which have arrows pointing to them. Up here, you should hopefully recognize this as the hypothalamus and this as the pituitary gland. These two are going to become really important in what we're going to be talking about next, which is controlling water concentration within the human body. So the hypothalamus contains specialized water receptors called osmoreceptors. So if you remember back, we talked about osmosis, which is the movement of water. So anything that starts with osmo refers to water. So in the hypothalamus, you have water detecting cells. These water detecting cells constantly monitor the concentration of water in the bloodstream. As water flows in the blood and that flows over the hypothalamus, these osmoreceptors detect whether the levels in the blood are too high or too low. In response to the concentration of water in the blood, the hypothalamus will release a hormone called antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone, you should know, is made in the hypothalamus and it's passed out of the pituitary gland into the bloodstream and it targets the kidneys. The role of antidiuretic hormone is to help to stimulate water to be reabsorbed back into the blood and not lost in urine. So out of this diagram here, this is really the only part we need to focus on right now. So the first scenario we're going to be looking at is when your water concentration of your blood is higher than you need it to be. So a common scenario would be that you've drunk a lot of water and your blood has a high water concentration. Now, if there's too much water in the blood, you don't want to keep it. Therefore, you send out less antidiuretic hormone to the from the hypothalamus, released out through the pituitary gland, and these messages will go to the kidney tubules, the little filtering units in the kidneys. So remembering that hormones are just chemical messengers, if you don't want to send out too many messages telling water to stay, less ADH is released, so therefore less water is kept by the body. If less water is kept by the body, what that means is that more water is passed out as urine. When more water is passed out as urine, this means that the water concentration of the blood starts to decrease and we return back to normal. If we look at the opposite situation here, we might feel dehydrated, you've gone a few hours without drinking, or you're standing out in the hot sun. The effect that any of these scenarios will have is that the water concentration of your blood is too low and you need to keep the water that you have. In order to keep the water that you have, the hypothalamus makes more ADH, it sends out more ADH from the pituitary gland. Therefore, more chemical messenger hormones tell the water to stay in the blood. This means less water is excreted, which means more water is reabsorbed back into the body. The effect that this has is that it raises the water concentration of the blood, and the volume of urine that you produce is quite small, and the urine appears to be more concentrated because there's less water in it. This diagram just summarizes what's going on in both situations. So if we start in the middle here, we are at our set point. The water content of the blood is normal, so we are exactly at balance. On the red side, we're saying that we've drunk too much water. So therefore, the blood water concentration is too high. This signal is detected by the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus. There's too much water in the blood, therefore less ADH is sent out via the pituitary gland to the kidneys. So less water is reabsorbed by the kidneys. This results in more urine being passed out, which means that there's lots of water being passed out of the body, and our blood water volume returns to normal. On the opposite side, let's say we've ingested too much salt, or we've lost a lot of water through sweat. Our blood water concentration is too low. Therefore, we have to secrete high concentration of ADH, which tells lots of water to stay in the body, so lots of water is reabsorbed by the kidney. This results in a small volume of concentrated urine being passed to the bladder. Therefore, less water is lost by the body, and that raises the blood water concentration back to normal. So you can see that if you understand one side of a feedback loop, it's easy to get the other one because it's just the exact opposite. All right, so now that we have covered all of that, here's a little summary explaining what's going on. Please take the time to read this and make sure you understand how antidiuretic hormone works, where it comes from, where it's secreted from, what organ it targets, and the effect that it has. All right, now that we're at the end of this lesson, what I would like you to do is to please read pages 11 to 14 of your booklet and complete the exercises on those pages. The answers are available for you to self-assess on our OneNote. Once you've done that, your homework is to complete pages 15 to 17 in the booklet. Again, the answers are there for you so you can self-assess. Once you've completed this lesson, there's also a quiz for you to complete, and you can do that using My Ed Online.